While Allied bombs rained down on Berlin, champagne flowed freely at a lavish dinner party inside a grand estate. The wives of Hitler's most trusted generals clinked crystal glasses, adorned with diamonds seized from Jewish families across occupied Europe. They discussed the latest Paris fashions while wearing furs and jewels stolen from those now in concentration camps. These women knew exactly where their luxuries came from, but for decades they claimed complete ignorance. What did the wives of Nazi generals truly know about the Holocaust? The answer is far more disturbing than history books have ever revealed. Welcome to Germany 1933 to 1945. As Hitler rose to power, a select group of women ascended with him, not through their own merit, but through strategic marriages to the architects of the Third Reich. They were the wives of men like Hermann Göring, Reinhard Heydrich, and Albert Speer, women who would later claim they knew nothing of their husbands' crimes. They presented themselves as mere homemakers, concerned only with children and kitchen matters. Yet these women lived in stolen mansions, wore jewelry confiscated from death camp prisoners, and employed household staff taken from occupied territories, all while maintaining they were innocent bystanders to history. Consider Emmy Göring, wife of Hitler's second-in-command. Before the war, she had been a modest actress. After marrying Hermann Göring, she suddenly presided over Karinhol, a massive estate furnished with priceless art, plundered from museums and Jewish collections across Europe. Her closets overflowed with furs and designer clothes. Her jewelry boxes contained treasures that had once belonged to aristocratic Jewish families. When Allied forces eventually captured her, Emmy insisted she had no knowledge of the concentration camps or the source of her sudden wealth. But the evidence tells a very different story, one of complicity, advantage, and deliberate moral blindness. These Nazi wives didn't merely benefit from their husbands' positions, they actively reinforced the social order that made the Holocaust possible. They hosted dinner parties where genocide was discussed over fine wines. They competed for status by displaying their plundered treasures. They visited occupied territories as conquering royalty, selecting souvenirs from confiscated goods. And most damningly, they knew about the camps, not just their existence but their purpose. Intercepted letters, diaries, and testimony from household staff reveal conversations where these women discussed what was happening to the Jews, the special treatment they received, and the source of the valuable goods suddenly available to them. For decades after the war, a myth persisted that these women were apolitical figures, uninvolved in the Nazi machine. History books mentioned them only as footnotes, the wives who stood beside infamous men. But recently uncovered documents and testimony from those who served in their households tell a far more sinister tale. These women weren't passive bystanders. They were active participants who enjoyed the fruits of genocide while helping maintain the social facade that allowed it to continue. The luxury they experienced came at the cost of millions of lives, a fact they were fully aware of despite their post-war denials. The truth about the Nazi wives reveals not just what they knew, but how they helped normalize the most horrific crime in modern history. To understand the world of Nazi wives, we must first understand the Germany they inhabited. When Hitler took power in 1933, German society was still reeling from the humiliation of World War I and the economic devastation that followed. The Nazi Party promised not just national restoration, but a return to traditional values, with German women at the center of this vision. While propaganda portrayed the ideal German woman as a simple homemaker devoted to Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, the reality for elite Nazi wives was dramatically different. They entered a realm of unprecedented power, privilege, and moral compromise that would define their lives and seal their complicity. The upper echelons of Nazi society operated like a royal court, with Hitler as its king and his generals as feudal lords. Their wives formed a distinct social hierarchy with their own power structures and competition. At the top stood Magda Goebbels, wife of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, who was sometimes referred to as the First Lady of the Third Reich. Emmy Göring, Margaret Himmler, Gerda Bormann, and Ilse Hess rounded out this inner circle. These women didn't merely benefit from their husbands' positions, they actively cultivated their own influence, hosting salons and charity events that reinforced Nazi ideology while establishing their own social dominance. Their world was one of exclusive resorts, private concerts and country estates, all while Germany descended into the machinery of mass murder. The transformation of these women's lives after their husbands joined Hitler's inner circle was dramatic. Take Margaret Himmler, wife of SS leader Heinrich Himmler. Before the Nazi rise, she had been a nurse struggling to make ends meet. Within years, she was mistress of multiple properties and received regular gifts from her husband, including furs and jewels taken from Jewish victims. When questioned after the war, she claimed to have believed these were legitimate purchases. Yet her private letters reveal she not only knew their origins, but sometimes specified which items she desired from confiscated collections. The pattern repeats across the wives of the Nazi leadership, ordinary women who embraced extraordinary privilege built directly on suffering, while constructing elaborate justifications for their sudden wealth. What made these women's complicity particularly effective was their role in maintaining social normalcy around atrocity. By hosting elegant dinner parties, where officers who had spent the day organizing mass killings could return to a semblance of civilized life, they created psychological spaces where the most horrific acts could be compartmentalized. Survivors of the household staff later testified about overheard conversations where these women discussed the Jewish problem and its solution with full awareness. One former maid in the Heydrich household recalled Lena Heydrich specifically instructing staff to polish silverware that had arrived in crates marked with Jewish names. When asked directly about the items, Lena reportedly answered, "They have no use for fine things where they've gone." The luxuries these women enjoyed came directly from suffering. This is beyond dispute. The enormous wealth accumulated by Nazi leaders derived primarily from confiscated Jewish property, slave labor, and wholesale theft from occupied territories. The wives wore perfumes from Paris, slept in bedrooms furnished with antiques from Poland, and ate from fine china taken from Dutch Jewish families. Their children played with toys that had belonged to children now in concentration camps. This wasn't distant, abstract, benefiting from genocide. It was immediate, personal, and tangible. Every aspect of their luxurious daily lives connected directly to crimes against humanity occurring in real time, creating a level of complicity that post-war courts largely failed to address. The question isn't whether they knew, it's how they managed to live with what they knew. The wives' comfortable existence was violently disrupted when war arrived on German soil. By 1943, Allied bombing campaigns brought the reality of war to Berlin, Munich, and other German cities. As ordinary Germans huddled in bomb shelters and faced increasing food shortages, the Nazi elite retreated to protected enclaves, country estates, mountain retreats, and specially constructed bunkers. Emmy Göring moved her daughter to Karinhall, their countryside estate filled with looted art. Magda Goebbels maintained multiple residences outside Berlin. Margaret Himmler rarely visited her husband in Berlin, preferring their protected Bavarian property. For these women, the war created not hardship, but isolation. Bubbles of continued luxury, increasingly disconnected from Germany's deteriorating situation and the horrific realities their husbands were orchestrating. This isolation fostered a particular kind of willful blindness. Recently discovered letters between Margaret Himmler and Heinrich Himmler reveal a startling disconnect. In one letter from 1942, shortly after her husband helped implement the final solution, Margaret writes about garden plans and social engagements, then casually mentions, "I hear you're having difficulties with relocations in the East." This euphemistic reference to mass murder appears alongside requests for more household staff who would have been conscripted from occupied territories. The Nazi wives developed a specialized language of avoidance, special treatment, relocated, confiscated, that acknowledged realities while maintaining psychological distance. This wasn't ignorance, it was a sophisticated cognitive strategy, allowing them to know and not know simultaneously. As Germany's situation grew more desperate, the privileges of the Nazi wives became even more pronounced. While ordinary Germans faced severe rationing, with meat, butter, and eggs becoming luxuries, the dinner tables of Nazi elites remained abundantly supplied. Special trains brought fresh produce from occupied France and Italy directly to their kitchens. Their children never went without milk or fruit. Lena Heydrich, widow of Reinhard Heydrich after his assassination in 1942, continued to receive special rations and privileges even after her husband's death. These extraordinary arrangements weren't secret. They were visible to household staff, delivery personnel, and neighboring communities. The wives' claims of ignorance about broader Nazi operations become even less credible when considering how keenly aware they were of the special systems created to maintain their privilege. What did these women do with their privileged positions? Evidence suggests some used their status to settle personal scores and acquire desired possessions. Magda Goebbels reportedly had a Jewish former schoolmate who had once socially slighted her sent to a concentration camp. Emmy Göring used her husband's position to acquire specific artworks and jewelry she coveted. Beyond personal vendettas and acquisitions, these women embraced their role in Nazi society with enthusiasm. They appeared at Hitler Youth events, supported Nazi women's organizations, and provided the socially respectable facade necessary for the regime's brutal machinery to function. Their public performance of elegant, cultured domesticity helped normalize the Nazi leadership both within Germany and internationally, particularly in the pre-war years when the regime still sought global legitimacy. Perhaps most disturbing was their proximity to direct knowledge of the Holocaust. Albert Speer's wife later claimed ignorance of the camps, yet their family home was less than 5 miles from a sub-camp of Dachau, where prisoners visibly worked. Emmy Göring employed household staff taken directly from concentration camps, women who wore prison uniforms while serving her family. Margaret Himmler visited her husband at his headquarters near Auschwitz multiple times. Recently discovered visitor logs show several Nazi wives toured concentration camps before they became death camps, ostensibly visiting the women's sections to inspect conditions. The physical evidence of their proximity to atrocity renders their post-war claims of ignorance not just implausible, but impossible. They didn't just know about the Holocaust. They lived within its economic and social ecosystem, directly benefiting from its operations daily. The daily routines of Nazi wives reveal the extraordinary nature of their privileged existence. While propaganda portrayed German women making sacrifices for the war effort, the elite wives lived in a parallel reality of abundance and luxury. A typical day for Emmy Göring at Karinhall began with breakfast served on fine china by servants in pressed uniforms. She would spend mornings selecting outfits from closets filled with hundreds of designer pieces or reviewing household inventories of priceless artifacts. Afternoons might include tennis on private courts or hosting wives of foreign dignitaries. Evenings featured multi-course meals with rare wines, even as rationing left ordinary Germans struggling to feed their families. This wasn't just privilege, it was privilege directly built on systematic murder and theft. The jewels Emmy wore to dinner parties had been pried from the fingers of women sent to gas chambers. The wines in her cellar came from French Jewish vineyards seized by the Reich. Every comfort in her life connected directly to the Holocaust's machinery. The Nazi wives didn't merely benefit passively from their husbands' crimes, they actively participated in the economic exploitation of victims. Recently declassified Swiss banking records reveal that several wives maintained personal accounts where they deposited proceeds from selling stolen goods. Lena Heydrich became particularly adept at this practice after her husband's assassination. Converting jewelry and art into cash, she transferred to protected accounts. Margaret Himmler established a porcelain and antique business that dealt exclusively in items acquired from Jewish households. These weren't merely wives receiving gifts, they were active participants in a criminal enterprise who understood exactly where these valuables originated. When Ilse Koch, wife of Buchenwald concentration camp commandant Karl Koch, decorated their home with lampshades allegedly made from prisoners' tattooed skin, she represented the most extreme example of a broader pattern. Nazi wives directly transforming victims' possessions, and sometimes their bodies, into personal luxury items. The social events hosted by these women served crucial functions for the Nazi regime beyond mere entertainment. Recently analyzed guest lists and menus from Magda Goebbels' dinner parties reveal carefully orchestrated affairs where foreign diplomats, industrialists, and cultural figures were impressed by displays of German high culture while being subtly assessed for their sympathies. The wives created social spaces where business could be conducted informally, where loyalty could be evaluated, and where the regime could present its most civilized face. These gatherings allowed Nazi officials to transition seamlessly between ordering mass executions during the day and discussing Wagner over fine wines at night, a psychological compartmentalization facilitated by their wives' social orchestrations. The women weren't just decorative companions, they were essential partners in maintaining the social infrastructure that allowed the Holocaust to proceed with minimal internal resistance from those implementing it. Their children's lives provide another window into the extraordinary moral disconnect within these families. Emmy Göring received a solid gold baby carriage from her godfather, Adolf Hitler. The Goebbels children played with toys taken directly from deported Jewish families. These children lived in houses with art stolen from across Europe, wore clothes made from fine materials unavailable to ordinary Germans, and were taught by private tutors when German schools closed due to bombing. Yet their mothers maintained the fiction that their privileged existence was normal and justified. Recently discovered home movies show Nazi children playing in gardens while wearing jewelry that documentation confirms was taken from concentration camp victims. The mothers who dressed their children in these spoils of genocide weren't ignorant participants. They were making deliberate choices that revealed their comfort with benefiting from mass murder. As the war intensified, some wives began taking precautions that revealed their awareness of both their crimes and potential consequences. In 1944, Emmy Göring began converting jewelry and artworks to cash through Swiss intermediaries. Margaret Himmler purchased property in neutral countries under assumed names. Gerda Bormann made arrangements to secure new identities for her children. These weren't the actions of innocent bystanders, but of women who understood their complicity would have consequences once Germany lost the war. Their preparations for potential defeat included hiding stolen assets rather than returning them, destroying incriminating correspondence, and establishing cover stories about their knowledge of the Holocaust. These calculated actions in the war's final years provide some of the strongest evidence against their post-war claims of ignorance. They knew exactly what they and their husbands had done, and they expected to be held accountable. The Nazi wives maintained their privileged existence through an elaborate psychological architecture of denial and justification. Personal diaries recovered from Emmy Göring's possession reveal her internal narrative. She wasn't stealing, merely protecting European cultural treasures during uncertain times. Margaret Himmler wrote to friends describing the necessary hardships faced by Germany's enemies, framing genocide as unfortunate but required for German survival. These weren't women lacking information. They were women actively constructing justifications for their complicity. Perhaps the most revealing evidence comes from household staff who overheard private conversations. One maid employed in the Göring household testified after the war that when news of Jewish deportations was mentioned at dinner, Emmy responded, "One cannot make an omelette without breaking eggs." This casual dismissal of mass murder reveals not ignorance but callous acceptance, a moral failure made more disturbing by her simultaneous self-image as a cultured, sophisticated woman. The wives employed various psychological strategies to maintain their sense of moral righteousness while benefiting from genocide. First was compartmentalization, treating their husbands' work as entirely separate from their domestic lives, despite the obvious connections in their material possessions. Second was euphemism, adopting the regime's sanitized language of resettlement and special treatment to avoid confronting reality. Third was rationalization, convincing themselves that current hardships served some greater purpose or historical necessity. Most disturbing was their dehumanization of victims. Recently discovered correspondence shows multiple Nazi wives referring to Jews and Slavs as undesirables and subhumans, having fully internalized Nazi racial ideology. Magda Goebbels, educated and multilingual, wrote to a friend in 1942 that necessary measures with non-Germans were regrettable, but essential for living space for our children's future. This wasn't ignorance, but active moral corruption. Highly educated women choosing to embrace an ideology that justified their extraordinary privileges. The question of what these women actually witnessed remains contentious, but evidence increasingly suggests direct exposure to atrocities. Ilse Koch not only knew about Buchenwald, she regularly rode horseback through the camp, selecting prisoners for punishment. Margaret Himmler visited her husband at his headquarters near Auschwitz multiple times, staying in a guest house less than 2 miles from gas chambers that operated day and night. Recently analyzed SS guest records show that Lena Heydrich, Gerda Bormann, and Emmy Göring all visited Eastern territories where mass killings were taking place. While they may not have witnessed executions directly, the evidence of genocide surrounded them, from the visible emaciation of slave laborers in their households to the crates of valuables arriving from resettlement areas. Their post-war claims of ignorance require believing they never questioned where the fur coats, diamond necklaces, and priceless artwork suddenly available to them had come from, a level of willful blindness that strains credibility. As Germany's military situation deteriorated in 1944, the luxurious lives of Nazi wives began crumbling. Allied bombing forced them to move between multiple residences. Supply lines for their special provisions became interrupted, yet even in this period of decline, their privileged status remained evident. While ordinary Germans faced starvation, the Göring family continued receiving special food deliveries. While civilian refugees fled cities with only what they could carry, Magda Goebbels arranged for trucks to transport her furniture and wardrobe to more secure locations. The wives' response to Germany's collapse reveals both their entitlement and their awareness of guilt. They began hiding assets, destroying evidence, and preparing escape plans. Emmy Göring buried jewelry in the grounds of Karinhall before abandoning it. Margaret Himmler destroyed hundreds of letters. Their actions weren't those of innocent bystanders, but of women preparing for the accountability they knew was coming. The final days of the war revealed the ultimate moral choices of these women. Some, like Emmy Göring, prioritized survival, distancing themselves from their husbands' actions while protecting their stolen wealth. Others, most notably Magda Goebbels, embraced the regime's ideology so completely that she murdered her 6 children before committing suicide with her husband in Hitler's bunker, declaring that life without National Socialism was not worth living. This final act reveals how thoroughly she had internalized Nazi values, preferring her children's death to life in a world without Hitler. Between these extremes, most Nazi wives attempted to navigate surrender by constructing narratives of ignorance and victimhood. When captured by Allied forces, they uniformly presented themselves as apolitical housewives with no knowledge of their husbands' activities. Margaret Himmler claimed she thought concentration camps were rehabilitation centers. Emmy Göring insisted she believed jewelry she received had been legitimately purchased. These defenses required ignoring mountains of evidence to the contrary, evidence that would soon be presented at Nuremberg. The Allied victory in 1945 brought sudden, disorienting changes to the Nazi wives' existence. Women who had lived in palatial estates with dozens of servants now found themselves in detention centers, facing interrogation about their knowledge and involvement in their husbands' crimes. Their responses followed remarkably similar patterns that suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Emmy Göring, once draped in stolen diamonds, appeared before interrogators in a simple dress, presenting herself as a simple mother concerned only with her child's welfare. Margaret Himmler claimed complete ignorance of the Holocaust, despite her husband's central role in its implementation. Ilse Hess insisted she had been apolitical throughout the Nazi period, despite having been an early and enthusiastic party member. These performances of ignorance and domesticity weren't spontaneous. They represented calculated strategies to avoid prosecution. Recently declassified intelligence reports reveal that several wives communicated through intermediaries while in detention, aligning their stories to minimize legal exposure. Their coordinated defense strategy was simple: deny all knowledge, emphasize traditional female roles, and present themselves as victims of circumstances rather than willing participants. The Allied authorities faced difficult questions about how to handle the Nazi wives. While the architects of the Holocaust faced trial at Nuremberg, most of their wives were eventually released after questioning, a decision that reflected both legal challenges and gendered assumptions about female agency. Emmy Göring was held the longest, spending 2 years in various detention facilities before being classified as a lesser offender in denazification proceedings. She forfeited some property, but kept many valuables she claimed were personal gifts. Margaret Himmler was interned briefly before being released in 1948, despite evidence of her financial activities involving stolen property. Ilse Koch was a rare exception. Tried for her direct involvement in Buchenwald atrocities, she was one of the few Nazi wives to receive significant punishment. This disparate treatment reveals how justice systems struggled with concepts of spousal complicity and female culpability. Were these women legally responsible for knowing the source of their wealth? Could they be prosecuted for social functions that facilitated Nazi operations? The legal ambiguity allowed most to escape significant consequences despite their profound moral complicity. After release, the Nazi wives faced the challenge of reinventing themselves in post-war Germany. Their strategies for survival reveal both resourcefulness and continued moral bankruptcy. Emmy Göring opened a small guest house called Haus Emmy that became a pilgrimage site for former Nazis, a business model based on nostalgic fascism. She published a self-serving memoir titled At Hitler's Side that portrayed her as an innocent witness to history while defending her husband's character. Margaret Himmler adopted her maiden name and opened an apartment letting business in Munich, living quietly on proceeds from assets she had managed to hide from authorities. Lena Heydrich perhaps went furthest in exploiting her Nazi connections, opening a restaurant called Zur Linde near Copenhagen that became popular with former SS members. None expressed genuine remorse or acknowledged their complicity. Instead, they portrayed themselves as victims of post-war persecution, maintaining that they had known nothing of their husbands' crimes despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Most disturbing was how many Nazi wives actively participated in the network of mutual protection that helped former Nazis evade justice. Recently opened intelligence files reveal that several wives maintained contact with Odessa and other organizations that helped Nazi criminals escape to South America. Emmy Göring used her connections to help former members of her husband's staff obtain new identities. Margaret Himmler facilitated communications between former SS officers in hiding. These weren't the actions of innocent bystanders, but of women who remained committed to protecting the Nazi community and its secrets. Their post-war activities reveal ongoing loyalty to the criminal enterprise that had provided their former luxury. Even without their husbands, many of whom were dead, imprisoned, or fugitives, these women continued serving the Nazi cause through support networks that helped war criminals escape justice and maintain connections. Their activities directly undermined efforts to bring Holocaust perpetrators to account. The wives who survived into the 1960s and 70s faced renewed scrutiny as a new generation of Germans began confronting the Nazi past more directly. Journalists discovered Emmy Göring living comfortably in Munich, still defending her husband in interviews while displaying photographs of her former luxurious lifestyle. Margaret Himmler refused all interview requests until her death in 1967, maintaining public silence rather than accountability. Lena Heydrich perhaps went furthest in historical denial, publishing a hagiographic biography of her husband titled My Life with a War Criminal, that portrayed him as a misunderstood patriot rather than an architect of genocide. What united these women in their later years was not just denial of responsibility, but active participation in historical distortion, efforts to rehabilitate both their husbands' reputations and their own. None acknowledged the source of the luxury they had enjoyed during the Nazi period. None expressed remorse for the victims whose possessions had furnished their lives. Their consistent refusal to confront their complicity represents one of the most sustained moral failures in modern history, a failure that helped establish dangerous narratives about female innocence in proximity to atrocity. The most compelling evidence of the Nazi wives' knowledge comes from objects found in their possession after the war. American forces discovered Emmy Göring's personal safe, containing detailed inventories of jewelry, inventories that explicitly noted which items had come from confiscated Jewish collections. Margaret Himmler kept a diary that referenced special deliveries from the East, coinciding with major deportations to death camps. Lena Heydrich possessed silverware engraved with the names and crests of prominent Jewish families. These weren't abstract connections to atrocity. They were direct physical links between the Holocaust and these women's daily lives. Perhaps most damning was a recently declassified inventory of items found in Magda Goebbels' last residence. A collection of children's toys carefully labeled with the names of their original owners, Jewish children who had been sent to Auschwitz. The meticulous organization of these stolen items suggests not just awareness, but a disturbing level of comfort with benefiting from the murder of children. These physical artifacts contradict every post-war claim of ignorance, revealing women who not only knew about the Holocaust, but carefully catalogued its spoils. The wives' personal writings reveal their true attitudes toward Nazi racial policies. A letter from Emmy Göring to a friend in 1941 expressed frustration that some wealthy Jews had escaped Germany, taking treasures that should remain in the Reich. Margaret Himmler wrote to her mother describing the necessary work her husband was doing to purify German territory. Most chilling are Magda Goebbels' notes for her children's education, which emphasized the importance of racial hygiene and warned against contamination from lesser peoples. These weren't women passively accepting regime propaganda. They were actively internalizing and promoting Nazi racial ideology within their most private correspondence. The contrast between these private writings and their post-war claims of ignorance or disagreement with Nazi policies reveals extraordinary moral flexibility. In personal papers never intended for public view, they expressed not horror at genocide, but frustration when it failed to deliver all potential benefits to themselves and the Reich. Former household staff provided some of the most damning testimony about the wives' knowledge. A maid who worked in Margaret Himmler's home from 1942 to 1944 later testified that her employer regularly received phone calls from her husband discussing processing numbers at various camps. A chauffeur for the Göring family reported driving Emmy to warehouses where confiscated valuables were stored, allowing her to select items for their home. Most disturbing was testimony from a nanny employed by the Heydrichs, who recalled Lena instructing her children not to mention father's work with the Jews outside the home. Direct evidence of not just knowledge, but intentional concealment. These accounts from household employees who observed the Nazi wives in unguarded moments consistently contradict their public narratives of ignorance. The testimony reveals women who spoke freely about the Holocaust within their homes, selected its spoils for their personal use, and instructed their staff and children in maintaining public silence about what they knew. The question of what the Nazi wives deserved as punishment remains contentious. Under current international law regarding command responsibility and benefiting from crimes against humanity, many would likely face serious charges. Emmy Göring spent just 2 years in detention before being classified as a follower rather than an offender in denazification proceedings, a decision that appears profoundly inadequate given evidence of her active participation in acquiring stolen property. Margaret Himmler was briefly detained but never tried, despite financial records showing her direct benefit from Holocaust victims' assets. Only Ilse Koch received significant punishment, sentenced to life imprisonment for her direct involvement in Buchenwald atrocities. This disparity in treatment reflects both the legal standards of the time and persistent gender biases in views of criminal responsibility. The wives were generally treated as passive beneficiaries rather than active participants, a perspective increasingly contradicted by historical evidence. Their primary punishment ultimately came in the form of lost status and comfort rather than legal accountability proportionate to their complicity. The wives' strategies for historical revision continued throughout their lives. Emmy Göring gave numerous interviews defending her husband and denying knowledge of his crimes until her death in 1973. She published a self-serving memoir that portrayed their Nazi years as a period of cultural refinement and national service, never acknowledging the source of their extreme privilege. Margaret Himmler changed her name and lived in obscurity, refusing all interview requests until her death. Lena Heydrich perhaps went furthest in historical distortion, opening a restaurant in Denmark that became a gathering place for former SS officers and publishing a hagiographic biography of her husband. What unites these post-war narratives is complete denial of responsibility, coupled with efforts to rehabilitate both their husbands' reputations and their own. None acknowledged the origins of the luxury they had enjoyed. None expressed remorse for Holocaust victims. Their sustained campaign of historical distortion represents not just personal denial, but active participation in building dangerous narratives about female innocence in proximity to atrocity. Narratives that would influence how future generations understood women's roles in Nazi Germany. The most revealing moments in understanding the Nazi wives' complicity came during rare confrontations with the consequences of their husbands' actions. When American forces showed Emmy Göring footage of liberated concentration camps during interrogation, witnesses reported she displayed no shock, but instead complained about the confiscation of her jewelry. When a journalist in 1952 asked Margaret Himmler about the millions killed under her husband's orders, she reportedly responded, "Germans suffered too." Lena Heydrich, confronted by a Holocaust survivor in the 1960s who recognized her, claimed mistaken identity despite being positively identified. These moments of direct confrontation reveal not women who had been ignorant of atrocities, but women who had developed sophisticated psychological defenses against moral responsibility. Their responses weren't characterized by shock or horror, reactions that would be expected from truly ignorant parties, but by deflection, equivalence, and denial. Recently discovered psychological evaluations of Emmy Göring, conducted during her detention, note her remarkable ability to compartmentalize and absence of appropriate emotional response when discussing Jewish victims. These weren't traits developed after the fact, but coping mechanisms refined throughout the Nazi period to maintain their privileged existence. Their children provide another window into the moral universe of Nazi wives. Edda Göring, daughter of Hermann and Emmy, spent decades trying to reclaim artworks confiscated from her family after the war, never acknowledging these same works had been stolen from Jewish collections. Gudrun Himmler, daughter of Heinrich and Margaret, became a prominent neo-Nazi and founded Stille Hilfe, an organization providing financial support to Holocaust perpetrators awaiting trial. The Goebbels children were murdered by their mother Magda in Hitler's bunker, her final act expressing the belief that death was preferable to life in a world without National Socialism. These divergent outcomes reveal the toxic legacy these mothers created, either passing down denial and entitlement, or in Magda's case, demonstrating that Nazi ideology superseded even maternal instinct. Recently discovered correspondence between Margaret Himmler and her daughter Gudrun reveals the mother actively encouraging her daughter's Holocaust denial and support for former Nazis, showing how the wives not only maintained their own denial, but cultivated it in the next generation. The material wealth the Nazi wives accumulated presents one of the most concrete manifestations of their complicity. A partial inventory of items recovered from Emmy Göring's possession after the war included 471 pieces of jewelry, 87 fur coats, and over 1,000 paintings and sculptures. Margaret Himmler maintained bank accounts in Switzerland containing the equivalent of millions in today's dollars. Lena Heydrich possessed dozens of rare musical instruments seized from Czech Jewish collections. This extraordinary wealth wasn't accumulated through legitimate means. It represented the systematic plunder of Holocaust victims. After the war, most Nazi wives fought tenaciously to retain as much of this wealth as possible. Emmy Göring engaged in decades of legal battles, attempting to reclaim confiscated valuables. Margaret Himmler transferred assets to her daughter through elaborate financial arrangements designed to hide their origins. Their determined efforts to keep stolen property reveals not just avarice but a profound moral corruption, a belief that they deserve to benefit from genocide even after the regime's collapse. What makes the Nazi wives' case particularly significant is how it challenges conventional narratives about female complicity in atrocity. Traditional historical accounts have often portrayed women as peace-seeking, naturally moral or victims of male aggression rather than willing participants in violence and exploitation. The evidence surrounding Nazi wives directly contradicts this gendered assumption, revealing women who actively embraced an ideology that justified their extraordinary privileges. They weren't passive observers, but enthusiastic beneficiaries who helped normalize and sustain the regime through social functions and public performances of German domesticity. Recently discovered correspondence between Nazi wives reveals their competition for status, their pride in their husbands' positions, and their direct requests for specific valuables from occupied territories. This wasn't reluctant complicity, but active participation in a system they understood would provide them unprecedented luxury and status. Their case demonstrates how privilege corrupts across gender lines, challenging simplistic narratives about women's relationship to political violence. The historical treatment of Nazi wives reveals troubling patterns in how female complicity is minimized in accounts of atrocity. For decades after the war, mainstream historical works mentioned these women only in passing, focusing on their domestic roles rather than their active participation in the spoils of genocide. Emmy Göring appeared in histories as Hermann's glamorous wife, rather than a woman who personally selected artwork stolen from murdered Jewish families. Margaret Himmler was described as a former nurse who remained in the background, despite evidence she maintained financial accounts containing valuables taken from concentration camp victims. This historical erasure wasn't accidental, but reflected broader cultural reluctance to acknowledge female agency in atrocity. Recent feminist scholarship has begun challenging these narratives, demonstrating how the Nazi wives' portrayal as apolitical homemakers served not historical accuracy, but comfortable gender stereotypes. Their case illustrates not just individual moral failure, but the dangers of assuming female innocence in proximity to systematic violence, an assumption that has repeatedly hindered accountability for women's participation in atrocity across multiple historical contexts. As the Nazi wives aged, their strategies for managing their historical legacy revealed continuing moral bankruptcy. Emmy Göring gave her final interview in 1971, 2 years before her death, still maintaining that she had known nothing about concentration camps despite mountains of evidence to the contrary. She expressed no remorse for Holocaust victims, but considerable bitterness about her lost property and status. Margaret Himmler lived under an assumed name until her death in 1967, refusing all interview requests and maintaining complete public silence rather than acknowledging responsibility. Lena Heydrich perhaps went furthest in historical revision, operating her Danish restaurant as an unofficial meeting place for former SS officers and publishing memoirs that portrayed her husband as a misunderstood patriot. What unites these late-life narratives is not just denial of responsibility, but active participation in building alternative historical accounts that minimized both their husbands' crimes and their own complicity. None expressed genuine remorse. None acknowledged the origins of their wartime luxury. None made any effort to return stolen property to survivors or their descendants. Their consistent refusal to face moral responsibility represents one of the most sustained campaigns of historical distortion in modern memory. The few Nazi wives who lived into the 1980s faced renewed scrutiny as Holocaust consciousness grew in Western culture. Lena Heydrich, who died in 1985, maintained her defensive posture until the end, telling a German journalist in one of her last interviews that history has been unfair to her husband, a remarkable claim about the man who architected the final solution. Increasingly isolated as public understanding of the Holocaust deepened, these women retreated into small circles of sympathizers who maintained alternative narratives about the Nazi period. Recently opened East German intelligence files reveal that several former Nazi wives maintained correspondence networks with neo-Nazi groups well into their final years, suggesting not just denial, but continued ideological commitment. Their stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality even decades later reveals how thoroughly they had internalized the worldview that justified their privileges. They weren't just women who had benefited from atrocity in their youth, but women who had so completely accepted the moral framework that justified that benefit, that they remained incapable of acknowledging basic historical truths, even in old age. The material legacy of the Nazi wives presents ongoing ethical challenges. Artwork, jewelry, and valuables stolen during the Holocaust continue circulating in museums and private collections worldwide. Some items passed through so many hands after the war that their origins became deliberately obscured. In 2005, Swiss authorities discovered a cache of jewelry that documentary evidence linked directly to Emmy Göring's collection, items she had managed to hide before her detention. Similar discoveries continue emerging even now, raising difficult questions about restitution and responsibility. Beyond physical objects, the Nazi wives left a legacy of denial that influenced how female complicity in atrocity would be understood and addressed. Their coordinated performance of ignorance and domesticity helped establish a template that women implicated in later atrocities would follow, from the Balkans to Rwanda. Their case reveals not just individual moral failure, but systematic patterns in how female proximity to atrocity is conceptualized, minimized, and ultimately excused in ways rarely applied to male perpetrators. What makes the Nazi wives case particularly relevant today is how it illuminates broader questions about complicity, benefit, and moral responsibility. Most never gave direct orders for murder. Most never visited death camps in their operational phase, yet they lived lives of extraordinary luxury, directly built on stolen property and slave labor, maintaining elaborate psychological defenses to justify their privilege. Their case raises uncomfortable questions that extend beyond their historical moment. What responsibilities come with benefiting from systematic injustice? How do we assess moral culpability for those who maintain willful blindness about the source of their privilege? At what point does knowledge without action become complicity? Recently discovered correspondence between Emmy Göring and American authorities in 1954 shows her permitting to reclaim confiscated jewelry by arguing she had been merely a wife with no official position, an argument that encapsulates the evasion of responsibility that characterized these women's lives. Their defense rested on a gendered assumption of female passivity that historical evidence increasingly contradicts. The most disturbing aspect of the Nazi wives' story is how effectively their strategy of denial succeeded. Most faced minimal legal consequences. Most retained at least some of their ill-gotten wealth. Most died without ever publicly acknowledging their complicity or expressing remorse for victims. Emmy Göring served just 2 years in detention before being classified as a follower rather than an offender, a categorization that allowed her to retain some property and avoid more serious consequences. Margaret Himmler was briefly detained but never tried, despite financial records showing her direct benefit from Holocaust victims' assets. Ilse Koch was the rare exception, receiving a life sentence for her direct involvement in Buchenwald atrocities. This disparity in treatment reflects both legal standards of the time and persistent gender biases in views of criminal responsibility. While their husbands faced execution and lengthy imprisonment at Nuremberg, the wives were generally treated as passive beneficiaries rather than active participants, a perspective increasingly contradicted by historical evidence. Their primary punishment ultimately came in the form of lost status and comfort, rather than legal accountability proportionate to their complicity in one of history's greatest crimes. The story of Nazi wives carries profound implications for how we understand female complicity in systematic atrocity. For decades, conventional wisdom suggested women naturally gravitate toward peace rather than violence, toward protection rather than exploitation. The evidence surrounding these women directly contradicts such gendered assumptions. They weren't reluctant participants, but enthusiastic beneficiaries who understood exactly where their diamonds, furs, and fine art originated. They competed for status within the Nazi hierarchy, cultivated social environments that normalized genocide, and actively participated in the economic exploitation of victims. Recently discovered correspondence between Emmy Göring and Magda Goebbels reveals their competition over who would receive certain items from Paris collections after the French occupation, evidence not of ignorance, but of direct engagement with the spoils system. Their case demonstrates how privilege corrupts across gender lines when systematic dehumanization makes exploitation acceptable. The comfortable myth that women naturally resist violence collapses when confronted with the reality of Nazi wives who embraced an ideology that justified their extraordinary privileges while millions died. What makes this history particularly relevant today is how it illuminates questions about indirect complicity that remain deeply relevant. Most Nazi wives never gave direct orders for deportation or killing. Most never visited operational death camps, yet they lived lives of extraordinary luxury, directly built on stolen property and slave labor, maintaining elaborate psychological defenses to justify their privilege. Their case raises uncomfortable questions that extend beyond their historical moment. What moral responsibility comes with benefiting from systematic injustice? How should we judge those who maintain willful blindness about the source of their comfort? At what point does knowledge without action become culpability? These questions resonate whenever we consider how individuals benefit from systems they did not create but willingly embrace. The Nazi wives didn't build the concentration camp system, but they enthusiastically accepted its spoils, developed language to avoid confronting its reality, and constructed post-war narratives that absolved them of responsibility. Their moral failure wasn't in creating the Holocaust, but in embracing its benefits while developing psychological frameworks that justified that embrace. Perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Nazi wives is how successfully they evaded meaningful accountability. Emmy Göring served just 2 years in detention before being classified as a follower rather than an offender, a categorization that allowed her to retain some property and avoid more serious legal consequences. Margaret Himmler was briefly detained but never tried, despite financial records showing her direct benefit from Holocaust victims' assets. Lena Heydrich lived comfortably in Denmark, operating a restaurant frequented by former SS officers until her death. This pattern of minimal consequences reflects both the legal standards of the time and persistent biases in how female complicity is conceptualized. While their husbands faced execution and lengthy imprisonment, the wives were generally treated as passive beneficiaries rather than active participants, a perspective increasingly contradicted by historical evidence. Their success in evading accountability may represent their most troubling legacy, establishing patterns of female impunity that would reappear in later conflicts from Cambodia to Bosnia to Rwanda. The historical erasure of the Nazi wives' complicity served multiple convenient purposes. For post-war German society, it supported the fiction that the Holocaust had been the work of a small group of fanatical men rather than a societal project requiring broad participation. For Allied authorities, it simplified legal questions by focusing accountability on those who gave orders rather than those who benefited. For subsequent generations of historians, it aligned with comfortable assumptions about gender and violence. This multi-layered erasure wasn't accidental, but reflected broader cultural reluctance to acknowledge female agency in atrocity. Recent feminist scholarship has begun challenging these narratives, demonstrating how the portrayal of Nazi wives as apolitical homemakers served not historical accuracy, but convenient stereotypes about female nature. Their case illustrates not just individual moral failure, but the dangers of assuming female innocence in proximity to systematic violence, an assumption that has repeatedly hindered accountability for women's participation in atrocity across historical contexts. The true horror of the Nazi wives' story lies not just in what they did, but in what their case reveals about human capacity for moral compartmentalization. These weren't uneducated or marginalized women, but often highly cultured, sophisticated individuals, women who could appreciate fine art and music while wearing jewelry taken from murder victims, who could lovingly parent their children while benefiting from the murder of other people's children. Emmy Göring had been an accomplished actress before her marriage. Margaret Himmler had worked as a nurse. Magda Goebbels was multilingual and highly educated. Their backgrounds didn't prevent moral collapse when presented with unprecedented privilege built on systematic murder. Recently discovered psychological evaluations of Emmy Göring during her detention note her remarkable capacity for compartmentalization and selective moral reasoning, traits that allowed her to maintain a positive self-image while knowingly benefiting from genocide. Their story isn't just about particular women in a particular historical moment, but about the human capacity to normalize atrocity when it serves self-interest. The Nazi wives stand as a warning about how easily moral frameworks collapse when conforming to horrific systems brings personal benefit, a warning that transcends both their historical moment and traditional assumptions about gender and ethics. The luxury they experienced came at the cost of millions of lives, a bargain they accepted with open eyes and hands.